The stagecoach wheels kicked up enough dust to choke a horse, but Katherine Elsworth barely noticed as she pressed her face against the window, watching her old life disappear behind a cloud of Nevada dirt. She had left everything behind in San Francisco, the mansion on Nob Hill, the servants, the silk dresses imported from Paris, and most significantly, the marriage contract her father had drawn up with Edmund Hartwell, a railroad magnate 3 times her age who collected young wives like other men collected pocket watches. The year was 1884, and Katherine had just committed what her family would consider an unforgivable sin. She had run away 3 days before her wedding, taking only what she could carry and enough money to buy passage to a place where nobody knew her name or her father's fortune. Tonopah, Nevada was nothing more than a scattered collection of wooden buildings and canvas tents when the stage rolled in at dusk. Katherine stepped down onto the dusty street, her fine leather boots already coated in the reddish-brown earth that seemed to cover everything in this godforsaken place. The driver tossed her single trunk down without ceremony, tipped his hat, and drove off toward the livery stable, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the street with the setting sun painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she were not so terrified. "You lost, miss?" The voice came from behind her, deep and rough like gravel underfoot. Katherine turned to find a man leaning against the post of what appeared to be a general store, his worn hat pulled low over his eyes. Even in the fading light, she could make out the strong line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders beneath a dust-covered shirt, and the way his gun sat easy on his hip like it belonged there. "I am looking for the boarding house," Katherine said, lifting her chin the way she had been taught since childhood, projecting a confidence she did not feel. "I was told there would be one here." The man pushed off from the post and walked toward her with the easy, rolling gait of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. As he came closer, she could see his eyes were a startling gray-blue, like storm clouds over the ocean, and there was something in them that made her breath catch not threat, but assessment, as if he could see right through the expensive fabric of her traveling dress to the frightened woman underneath. "There is," he said, gesturing down the street with one calloused hand. "Mrs. Chen runs it. Clean beds, decent food. You planning on staying long?" "I do not know," Katherine said honestly, because she had not planned beyond getting away. "I'm looking for work." That made him pause, his eyes traveling over her fine dress, her soft hands, the way she held herself like someone who had never done a hard day's labor in her life. "Work," he repeated, and there was no mockery in his voice, just curiosity. "What kind of work can you do?" It was a fair question, and one Katherine had been asking herself for the past 3 days. She could speak French and passable Italian. She could paint watercolors and play the piano. She could plan a dinner party for 50 guests and knew which fork to use for which course. But none of those skills seemed particularly useful in a Nevada mining town. "I can read and write," she said finally. "I can do figures. I am good with organization and planning." The man studied her for a long moment, and Katherine found herself unable to look away from those storm cloud eyes. "Zachariah Harper," he said finally, touching the brim of his hat. "Most folks call me Zach. I run the freight operation here, wagons, supplies, mail runs between here and the bigger towns. My bookkeeper quit last week, said his lungs could not take the dust anymore and headed back east. If you are serious about work, you can come by the office tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock sharp." Katherine felt something loosen in her chest, something she had not realized was pulled tight. 6 o'clock, she repeated. "Thank you, Mr. Harper." "Zach," he corrected, then gestured again toward the boarding house. "Come on, I will walk you there. Not safe for a woman alone after dark, even in a small town like this." They walked in silence down the rutted street, Katherine's trunk bumping against Zach's leg with each step. She wanted to tell him she could manage it herself, but the truth was, she had never carried anything heavier than a parasol in her entire life, and her arms were already aching. The boarding house turned out to be a neat 2-story building with a covered porch and actual glass in the windows, which seemed like a luxury compared to some of the other structures she had passed. Mrs. Chen was a tiny Chinese woman with iron gray hair and sharp black eyes that took in everything about Katherine in a single glance. "She need room," she said to Zach, not bothering to phrase it as a question. "She does," Zach confirmed, setting down the trunk. "And she might be staying a while. I just hired her." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. $20 a month, includes breakfast and supper, no men in rooms, no drinking, no loud noise after 9 o'clock. Katherine did quick calculations in her head. She had enough money to last maybe 4 months if she were careful. By then, she would need to be earning enough to support herself, or else she would have to choose between crawling back to San Francisco in disgrace or starving. "I will take it," she said. Mrs. Chen nodded again and produced a key from somewhere in her voluminous apron. "Room 5, upstairs. Supper is in 1 hour if you want. Hot water costs extra." After Zach left and Katherine had been shown to a room, a simple space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the street, she sat down on the mattress and let herself shake. She had done it. She had actually escaped. Edmund Hartwell, with his cold hands and colder eyes, would not be her husband. Her father would not be able to trade her like a business asset to cement another deal. She was free. Or at least, she was free and completely alone in a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money to survive and no idea if she could actually do the work Zach Harper had offered her. Katherine looked down at her hands, soft and pale and utterly useless, and wondered what she had been thinking. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Edmund's face the way he had looked at her, like she was something he had purchased, something to be displayed and used and eventually discarded when a newer model came along. And she knew that whatever happened here in Tonopah, whatever hardships she faced, it would be better than that. At least here, she had a choice. The next morning, Katherine presented herself at the freight office at precisely 6 o'clock, wearing the simplest dress she owned, which was still far too fine for a dusty Nevada town, but it was the best she could do. Zach was already there, going over a stack of papers by lamplight, and he looked up when she entered with an expression that might have been surprise or approval or both. "You came," he said. "You offered me work," Katherine replied. "Why would I not?" Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Most women who look like you do not show up at 6 in the morning ready to work." He gestured to a desk in the corner, smaller than his but still substantial, covered in ledgers and loose papers. "That's yours if you want it. Previous bookkeeper left everything in a hell of a mess. I need someone who can track shipments, manage accounts, keep the books balanced, and help me plan routes. Pay is $40 a month to start. If you work out, it goes up." $40 a month. It was less than Katherine used to spend on a single hat, but it was enough to survive on, with a little left over for savings. She nodded and moved to the desk, pulling out the chair and sitting down with more confidence than she felt. "Where should I start?" The first week was brutal. Katherine had never worked a full day in her life, let alone 6 days in a row with only Sunday off. Her back ached from sitting at the desk, her eyes burned from trying to decipher the previous bookkeeper's chaotic handwriting, and her head throbbed from calculating figures for hours on end. But slowly, she began to make sense of the chaos. She reorganized the ledgers, created a new system for tracking shipments, and discovered that Zach was being systematically overcharged by one of his suppliers in Virginia City. "Look at this," she said on Friday afternoon, spreading 3 months of invoices across his desk. "They are charging you 15% more than the agreed rate. It is buried in the itemization, so it would not be obvious unless you checked every line." Zach leaned over the papers, so close she could smell the sun-warmed scent of his skin, and swore under his breath. "That is damn near $200 over 3 months. He looked up at her, and there was something new in his eyes, respect. "How did you catch that?" "I checked every line," Katherine said simply. "That is what you hired me to do." He laughed, a real laugh that transformed his face from stern to almost boyish. "I hired you because I needed someone who could add and subtract. I did not expect to get someone who could save me from being robbed blind." He straightened up, still smiling. "You earned that raise already. $50 a month, starting now." Katherine felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the Nevada heat. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. As the weeks passed, Katherine fell into a rhythm. She woke before dawn, dressed in increasingly simpler clothes that she bought from the general store, and arrived at the office before Zach. She worked through the morning, broke for a quick lunch that she usually ate at her desk, worked through the afternoon, and returned to the boarding house for supper just as the sun was setting. It was exhausting and sometimes tedious, but it was hers. Every dollar she earned came from her own labor, not her father's wealth or a husband's generosity. And slowly, Almost without realizing it, she began to take pride in that. She also began to notice things about Zach, the way he always made sure the drivers had water before they set out on long runs, how he knew the names of everyone in town and asked after their families, the patience with which he dealt with difficult customers and the firmness with which he stood his ground on fair prices. He was unfailingly polite to her, never presumptuous, but sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. 2 months after her arrival, a woman swept into the office in a rustle of silk and expensive perfume. She was beautiful in a calculated way, with golden curls and a tiny waist cinched by a corset, and she looked at Katherine like one might look at a bug. "Zachariah," she purred, ignoring Katherine entirely, "I have been waiting for you to call. Surely you have not been so busy with your little freight business that you have forgotten about me." Zach stood up from his desk, his face carefully neutral. "Miss Patterson, what can I do for you?" "You can escort me to the dance tomorrow night, for starters," she said, trailing one gloved finger along the edge of his desk. "Everyone who is anyone will be there, and I simply cannot arrive alone." "I am not much for dancing," Zach said, and Katherine heard the polite dismissal in his voice, even if Miss Patterson did not. "Oh, do not be tiresome," Miss Patterson said with a practiced laugh. "You know you will come around eventually. You always do." She finally glanced at Katherine, her eyes cold. "Who is this?" "Katherine Elsworth," Katherine said before Zach could answer, meeting the other woman's gaze steadily. "I manage Mr. Harper's accounts." "How quaint," Miss Patterson said, making it sound like an insult. "Well, I suppose someone has to do the tedious work." She turned back to Zach. "Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Do not keep me waiting." And she swept out the way she had come, leaving a cloud of perfume in her wake. Zach let out a long breath and ran a hand through his hair. "Sorry about that. Vivian does not understand the word no." "You're going to the dance?" Katherine asked, trying to keep her voice neutral and not entirely succeeding. "Hell no," Zach said bluntly. "I meant what I said. I'm not much for dancing, and I'm definitely not interested in Vivian Patterson." He paused, then added, "Her father owns the biggest mine in the county. She thinks that means she can have whatever she wants." Katherine looked down at her ledger, feeling something twist in her chest. "I know the type," she said quietly. There was a long silence, and then Zach asked, "Is that why you came here, running from someone who thought they could have you?" Katherine's hands stilled on the page. She had been so careful not to talk about her past, not to give anyone reason to ask questions. But something about the gentle curiosity in Zach's voice made her want to answer honestly. "Yes," she said simply. "My father arranged a marriage. I disagreed with his choice." "And the man you were supposed to marry?" "Rich, powerful, used to getting what he wants." Katherine looked up and found Zach watching her with those storm cloud eyes. "I left 3 days before the wedding." Zach was quiet for a long moment, and Katherine braced herself for judgment for him to tell her she had been foolish, that she had thrown away security for nothing, that she should have just accepted her fate like a good daughter. But instead, he said, "That took courage." Something in Katherine's chest cracked open. "Or stupidity," she said, trying to laugh but hearing how it came out shaky. "I had everything most women dream of: wealth, status, a life of comfort, and I walked away for the hope that maybe somewhere there might be something real." "Real love, you mean," Zach said, and it was not a question. "Yes," Katherine whispered. "Is that foolish?" Zach stood up and came around his desk, leaning against it so he was closer to her. "You traded wealth for the hope of real love," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "No, Miss Elsworth, that is not foolish. That is brave as hell." He paused, then added with quiet intensity, "And for what it is worth, I think you made the right choice." Katherine felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you know." Something shifted between them in that moment. Some invisible line crossed. Zach reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were calloused and gentle, and Katherine found herself leaning into the touch without meaning to. "Katherine," he said, and the way he said her name made her whole body warm. "Would you like to go to that dance with me? I know I said I am not much for dancing, but I think I could make an exception." "Yes," Katherine said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was, how sure. "I would like that very much." The dance was held in the largest building in Tonopah, which was still just a wooden structure with sawdust on the floor, but someone had hung lanterns from the rafters, and there was a fiddle player and a man with a guitar, and people had dressed in their finest. Katherine wore the one good dress she had brought from San Francisco, a deep green silk that brought out the color of her eyes. And when she came downstairs at the boarding house and found Zach waiting for her in a clean shirt and string tie, the look on his face made her feel more beautiful than any amount of expensive jewelry ever had. "You look like a dream," he said simply, offering his arm. The whole town seemed to be there, and Katherine felt the weight of curious stares as she walked in on Zach's arm. She knew what they were thinking, that she was too fine, too different, that she did not belong. She saw Vivian Patterson across the room, her face turning red with fury. But then Zach led her onto the dance floor and pulled her into his arms, and suddenly none of it mattered. "I should warn you," Katherine said as they began to move to the music. "I was taught to dance by a very stern Frenchwoman who believed fun was a sign of poor character." Zach laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest where her hand rested. "Well then, we had better be very improper and enjoy ourselves." They danced 3 dances in a row, and Katherine could not remember the last time she had smiled so much. Zach was a better dancer than he had let on, strong and sure, guiding her through the steps with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything. When the music finally slowed and the fiddle player struck up a waltz, he pulled her closer, close enough that she could feel the beat of his heart. "People are staring," Katherine murmured. "Let them," Zach said. "Katherine, I need to tell you something." Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could feel it. "What?" "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for weeks now," he said, his voice low and rough. "Ever since that first day when you showed up looking like you had stepped out of a painting but too damn stubborn to admit you were scared. You could have stayed in your safe life, married your rich man, never worked a day. But you chose this instead. You chose to bet on yourself, on the chance that there might be something better out there. And Katherine, I know we have not known each other long, but I need you to know that Zachariah Harper." Vivian Patterson's shrill voice cut through the music like a knife. She pushed through the other dancers, her face twisted with rage. "How dare you ignore me for this nobody? Do you have any idea who I am, who my father is?" Zach's jaw tightened, but his voice was calm. "I know exactly who you are, Vivian, and I'm asking you politely to leave us alone." "Leave you alone?" Vivian's voice rose higher. "With her? Everyone knows she just showed up out of nowhere. She is probably a criminal or worse. Did you know," she said, turning to address the gathered crowd, "that she was supposed to marry Edmund Hartwell? The Edmund Hartwell. But she ran away like a coward." The room went silent. Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. Somehow Vivian had found out, had dug into her past and discovered her shame. She waited for Zach to drop her hand, to step away, to realize that she had brought scandal and trouble to his door. Instead, he pulled her closer. "Yes," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the silent room. "She was supposed to marry a man 3 times her age who her father picked out for her. And instead of accepting a life where she would have been nothing more than a pretty object on a rich man's shelf, she walked away. She gave up everything, money, status, comfort, for the hope that maybe somewhere she could find something real, something that mattered." He turned to look directly at Vivian. "You call that cowardice? I call it the bravest damn thing I've ever heard." Katherine felt tears spill over and did not care who saw. Zach turned back to her, cupping her face in his calloused hands. "You made the right choice," he said again, fierce and certain. "And if you will have me, I would like to spend the rest of my life proving to you that real love is worth more than all the gold in California." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Vivian made a strangled sound and fled, but Katherine barely noticed. She was looking up at Zach, at the honesty and hope and love written plain on his face, and feeling something in her chest expand until she thought she might burst with it. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will have you. I think I've been falling in love with you since you carried my trunk and did not once mock me for being useless." "You were never useless," Zach said, and then he kissed her in front of everyone, deep and thorough and tender, and the crowd whistled and stamped their approval. That night, walking back to the boarding house under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet, Zach took her hand. "I need you to know something," he said. "I am not a rich man. I make a decent living with the freight business, but I cannot give you mansions or servants or silk dresses from Paris." "Good," Katherine said firmly, "because I do not want those things. I want a life where I matter, where I am valued for who I am, not what I am worth. I want to wake up every morning and know that the man beside me chose me, not my father's money." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "I want you, Zach. Just you." He kissed her again, slower this time, and Katherine felt it all the way down to her toes. When they finally pulled apart, he was smiling. "Then we'd better start planning a wedding, because I am not letting you get away." They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the tiny church on the edge of town. Katherine wore a new dress, nothing like the elaborate wedding gown that had been waiting for her in San Francisco, but she loved it because she had bought it with money she earned. Mrs. Chen cried, which she claimed was because of dust allergies. Half the town showed up, bringing food and gifts and good wishes, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zach kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Their life together was not easy. They bought a small house on the outskirts of town, and Katherine learned to cook, which involved a lot of burned meals and patient instruction from Mrs. Chen. She continued to manage the books for the freight business, which grew steadily under their joint management. Zach taught her to ride, putting her on the gentlest mare in the stable and laughing when she screamed the first time the horse trotted. She taught him to appreciate classical music, playing the piano at the saloon on Sunday afternoons when it was closed. But through it all, they built something that Katherine had never had before: a real partnership. Zach asked her opinion on business decisions and listened when she spoke. She learned to trust him with her fears and doubts. They argued sometimes because Katherine had opinions and Zach had a stubborn streak a mile wide, but they always worked it out. And every night, when they climbed into bed together in their little house, Katherine felt grateful beyond measure that she had been brave enough to run away. A year after their wedding, a letter arrived from San Francisco. Katherine recognized her mother's handwriting and almost did not open it, but Zach encouraged her to at least see what it said. Inside was a short note. "Katherine, your father has disowned you formally, as I suppose you expected. Edmund Hartwell married a shipping magnate's daughter 6 months after you left. But I thought you should know that I am proud of you. I never had the courage to choose my own path, and I spent my entire life regretting it. I hope you have found what you were looking for. I hope you are happy. With love, Mother." Katherine cried when she read it, and Zach held her until the tears stopped. "Are you happy?" he asked gently. "Yes," Katherine said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I'm so happy I can hardly believe it sometimes. I wake up and I'm afraid it is all a dream." "It is not a dream," Zach promised. "This is real. We are real." 2 years after their marriage, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified. She knew nothing about babies, had never held one in her life, but Zach was thrilled. He hovered over her like she might break, which drove her crazy until she finally told him that she was pregnant, not made of glass, and he needed to stop treating her like an invalid. "I just want to take care of you," he protested. "You do take care of me," Katherine said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "Every single day, in 100 small ways, but I need you to trust that I can do this, that we can do this together." Their son was born on a blazing, hot July day in 1887. They named him Jacob, and he had his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Zach cried when the midwife placed the baby in his arms, tears streaming down his face unashamedly. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Katherine, he is perfect." Watching her husband hold their son, Katherine thought about the life she had run away from. If she had married Edmund Hartwell, she might have had children too, but they would have been obligations, heirs to pass down wealth and status. They would have been raised by nannies and governesses, seen at scheduled times, and expected to be perfectly behaved. They would never have known what it felt like to be truly, desperately loved. Jacob would know. Jacob would grow up in a house full of laughter and arguments and music and love. He would see his parents work together, support each other, choose each other every single day. And maybe, if they were lucky, he would learn that wealth and status meant nothing compared to the kind of love that made you brave enough to bet everything on hope. The years passed, and they were good years. The freight business continued to prosper. Katherine took on more responsibilities, eventually managing the entire operation, while Zach focused on acquiring new contracts and routes. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Sarah, 2 years after Jacob, and another son named Michael, 3 years after that. The little house grew crowded, so they built onto it, adding rooms as they added children. Katherine never regretted her choice, not even once. There were hard times, a brutal winter when half the livestock died, a drought that nearly bankrupted several of their clients, childhood illnesses that kept her up night after night praying. But through it all, she had Zach, and that made everything bearable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zach took her up into the hills above Tonopah to watch the sunset. They sat on a flat rock with his arm around her shoulders, looking down at the town that had become their home. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like?" Zach asked. "If you had stayed? If you had married him?" Katherine thought about it seriously, because Zach deserved an honest answer. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I wonder if I would have grown used to it. If eventually I would have stopped feeling like a possession and just accepted that was what I was supposed to be." She turned to look at him, this man who had carried her trunk on the first day they met, who had offered her work when she was desperate, who had stood up for her in front of the whole town and declared her brave. "But then I remember what it feels like to be loved for who I am, not what I represent. To be valued for my mind and my strength, not just my face or my family name, and I know that I made the right choice." "You did," Zach said softly. "You made the right choice, and I thank God every day that you did. Because, Katherine, you were the best thing that ever happened to me." They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. And Katherine thought about that frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 10 years ago, carrying a single trunk and no idea what she was going to do. She wished she could go back and tell her younger self that it was going to be hard, but it was going to be worth it. That the hope she was chasing was real, and that she would find it in the most unexpected place in a dusty freight office, in the arms of a cowboy who saw her for who she truly was. But she could not go back, and maybe that was for the best. Some lessons you had to learn by living them. As they rode back down to the town, to the house where their 3 children were probably driving Mrs. Chen crazy with their energy, Katherine felt a deep, abiding contentment settle over her. This was her life, chaotic and messy and sometimes exhausting, but hers. Built on her own choices, sustained by her own work, filled with a love so real and true, it still took her breath away. "I love you," she said suddenly, and Zach turned to look at her with surprise and pleasure. "I love you too," he said. "Always have. Always will. Even when I burned dinner last week so badly we had to air out the house for 2 days?" "Even then," Zach confirmed, laughing. "Though I would appreciate it if you stuck to managing the books and let Mrs. Chen handle the cooking." Katherine swatted his arm, but she was laughing too. This was what happiness felt like, she realized. Not perfection, but partnership. Not wealth, but worth. Not status, but being seen and known and loved anyway. The next decade brought more changes. Jacob grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and wanted to be a teacher. Sarah was wild and fearless, constantly getting into scrapes and coming home with scraped knees and elaborate stories. Michael was gentle and artistic, drawing pictures of everything he saw with careful attention to detail. Katherine watched them grow with a fierce, protective love that sometimes frightened her with its intensity. Zach expanded the business, adding passenger routes to the freight service. Katherine suggested they hire women as bookkeepers and clerks, which was almost unheard of, but proved so successful that other businesses in town started copying them. Together, they built something that was theirs in a way that went beyond ownership. It was a reflection of their values, their partnership, their belief that hard work and fairness mattered more than tradition. When Katherine was 38 years old, she received word that her father had died. She had not spoken to him in nearly 15 years, and she felt surprisingly little at the news. But her mother's letter, written in a shaky hand, moved her to tears. "He never forgave you, Katherine, but in his final days, he asked about you. I told him you were happy, that you had built a good life with a good man, He said nothing, but I like to think he understood, finally, what you were trying to tell him all those years ago. I am coming to visit, if you will have me. I want to meet my grandchildren. I want to see the life you chose. With love always, Mother. Katherine showed the letter to Zach, who read it carefully and then looked up at her with gentle eyes. What do you want to do? I want her to come, Katherine said. I want her to see that I made the right choice, that wealth is not the only thing that matters, that love, real, true, everyday love, is worth more than any amount of money. Her mother arrived 3 months later, a tiny woman who looked far older than her years. She stepped off the stage in Tonopah and looked around with wide eyes, taking in the dusty streets and simple buildings. When Katherine approached with Zach and the children, her mother's eyes filled with tears. You look happy, she said wonderingly. You look so happy. I am, Katherine said simply, and pulled her mother into a hug. That week, Katherine showed her mother everything the house she and Zach had built, the freight office where she worked, the school where Jacob studied, the places where Sarah and Michael played. She introduced her to Mrs. Chen and the other women in town who had become her friends. She let her mother see the life she had built from nothing, sustained by her own choices and the love of a good man. On her mother's last night, as they sat on the porch watching the desert stars, her mother took her hand. I am so proud of you, she said quietly. I told you that in a letter, but I needed to say it to your face. You did what I never could. You chose love over security, and you made it work. Your father was wrong about you. You were not foolish or reckless, you were brave. Katherine squeezed her mother's hand, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. That means everything to me. This man of yours, her mother continued, glancing toward the door where Zach was putting the children to bed. He is a good one. The best, Katherine agreed. He sees me, Mother, not what I could be or what I should be, but who I actually am. And he loves me anyway. That is all any of us can hope for, her mother said softly, to be seen and loved for exactly who we are. When her mother left, Katherine felt something settle in her heart that she had not realized was still unsettled. Her mother's approval should not have mattered after all these years, but somehow it did. It felt like a final piece falling into place, a last door closing on the life she had left behind. The years continued to roll forward, bringing their share of joys and sorrows. Zach's father died, and they made the long trip to Colorado for the funeral. Sarah broke her arm falling out of a tree and had to wear a splint for 6 weeks, during which she drove everyone crazy with her inability to sit still. Michael sold his first painting to a woman passing through town, and his face when she handed him the money was worth more than the $5 she paid. Jacob was accepted to a teaching college in Carson City, and Katherine cried as they put him on the stage, proud and heartbroken all at once. Through it all, Katherine and Zach remained partners in every sense of the word. They still worked together every day, still argued about business decisions and child-rearing philosophies, still made love with the kind of passion that came from truly knowing another person. On hard days, when Katherine was exhausted from juggling work and children and household management, Zach would take her hands and remind her that they were in this together. On the days when Zach was frustrated with difficult clients or money troubles, Katherine would sit with him and help him work through solutions, her mind still as sharp as it had been the day she caught the supplier overcharging them. They were a team, a partnership, a unit, and that, Katherine realized, was what made everything possible. When Katherine turned 45, the children decided to throw a surprise party. Jacob came home from college, Sarah managed to keep the secret for a full week, and Michael painted a portrait of the family that brought Katherine to tears. But the best part was watching Zach stand up and make a speech, his voice rough with emotion. 20 years ago, a woman stepped off a stage in this town and changed my life forever. She was wearing a fancy dress and carrying one small trunk, and she looked like she had wandered into the wrong story. But she had not. She had walked away from everything she knew because she believed that somewhere out there had to be something real, something true. And somehow, by some miracle I still do not understand, she found it with me. He turned to look directly at Katherine, his storm cloud eyes still as clear and honest as they had been that first day. You traded wealth for the hope of real love, and Katherine, I want you to know that I have spent every day of these 20 years trying to prove to you that you made the right choice. I hope I have succeeded, because loving you has been the greatest honor of my life." Katherine stood up and went to him, not caring that everyone was watching, and kissed him thoroughly. "You did," she said when they finally pulled apart. "You proved it every single day. You proved it when you gave me work. You proved it when you stood up for me at that dance. You proved it when you held our babies and changed diapers and stayed up all night with sick children. You proved it every time you asked my opinion and actually listened. You proved it by seeing me as your equal, your partner, your match." She took his face in her hands. "I made the right choice, Zach. I made the best choice of my life." The room erupted in applause, and their children rushed forward to hug them both. Katherine looked around at this life she had built, at her grown son who was becoming a teacher, her wild daughter who was talking about becoming a doctor, her artistic son who saw beauty in everything, her husband who still made her heart race after 20 years and felt such profound gratitude. It almost overwhelmed her. This was what she'd been searching for that day she ran away. Not wealth or status or security, but belonging, being seen, being valued, being loved for exactly who she was. Years continued to pass. Jacob got married to a sweet woman named Emma who taught music. Sarah did become a doctor, despite everyone telling her it was impossible for a woman, and Katherine had never been more proud. Michael opened a studio in Virginia City, and his paintings sold well enough that he could support himself with his art. Zach's hair went gray, and Katherine found she loved him even more with silver at his temples. They had grandchildren. Jacob and Emma had 2 daughters, and Sarah eventually married a fellow doctor and had twin boys. Michael married a woman he met at an art exhibition, and they had 1 son who showed signs of being as artistic as his father. Katherine and Zach spoiled them all shamelessly, and their house was frequently full of noise and chaos and love. On their 30th anniversary, Zach took Katherine back up to the hills above Tonopah to watch the sunset, just like he had on their 10th. They were older now, moving a bit slower, but the love between them had only deepened with time. "Oh, I have been thinking," Zach said as they sat on the same flat rock, "about that day you arrived. How scared you must have been, even though you hid it well. How brave you had to be to step into the unknown like that." "I was terrified," Katherine admitted. "I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew I could not marry Edmund, could not spend my life being someone's possession." "You told me once that you traded wealth for the hope of real love," Zach said, taking her hand. "I want you to know that I understand what that cost you, what you gave up, and I want you to know that every single day I have tried to make sure you never regretted it." Katherine turned to look at him, this man who had been her partner and lover and best friend for 30 years. "Zach," she said seriously, "I need you to listen to me. I have never, not for 1 single second, regretted choosing you, choosing this life. Yes, I gave up wealth. I gave up status and comfort and security. But what I got in return was worth infinitely more. I got a life that was mine. I got work that mattered and children who are kind and strong. I got to wake up every morning next to a man who valued my mind as much as my face, who saw me as an equal, who loved me for who I was, not what I represented." She squeezed his hand. "You gave me everything that mattered, Zach. Everything that was real." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, and Katherine thought about the long, winding path that had brought her here. If someone had told her, that day she fled San Francisco, that she would end up in a tiny Nevada town married to a freight operator, she would have been terrified. But if they had told her she would be deliriously happy, surrounded by love and family and purpose, she would have run toward it even faster. "What are you thinking about?" Zach asked, and Katherine realized she was smiling. "I am thinking," she said, "about how foolish everyone thought I was, running away from wealth and security for something as intangible as hope. But I was not foolish, Zach. I was right. Love is real. True partnership is real. Building a life based on respect and equality and genuine affection, that is all real. And it is worth more than all the mansions and silk dresses in the world." "You made the right choice," Zach said, just like he had all those years ago. But this time, Katherine could see the proof of it all around her in their children and grandchildren, in the business they had built together, in the 30 years of partnership and love they had shared. "I did," Katherine agreed. "I really did." They stayed on the hill until the stars came out, those familiar Nevada stars that Katherine had learned to love. Then they rode back down to town, to the house that had grown and changed with their family, to the life they had built together, one choice at a time. That night, lying in bed with Zach's arm around her and the sound of desert wind outside the window, Katherine thought about the letter she had received from her mother all those years ago. "I hope you have found what you were looking for," her mother had written. She had, Katherine realized. She had found exactly what she was looking for, even though she had not fully understood what that was when she started searching. She had found a love that saw her as whole and complete, not as property or decoration. She had found work that used her mind and skills. She had found a place where she belonged, not because of her family name or her father's wealth, but because of who she was and what she contributed. Most importantly, she had found out that she was braver than she thought, that the hope she had clung to, the belief that there had to be something better than the life she was running from, was justified. That taking a leap into the unknown was terrifying but necessary, and that sometimes the greatest rewards came from the biggest risks. "I love you," she whispered to Zach, who was already half asleep. "Love you too," he mumbled, pulling her closer. "Always have, always will." Katherine closed her eyes and let herself drift off, feeling safe and loved and exactly where she belonged. The scared woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 30 years ago would hardly recognize her, now strong and confident and surrounded by family. But she would recognize the feeling in Katherine's chest, that sense of rightness, of having finally found what she had been searching for. She had traded wealth for the hope of real love, and she had won everything that mattered. The years continued to flow by like water, bringing changes but also constants. The freight business eventually passed to Jacob, who ran it with the same integrity his parents had. Sarah's medical practice flourished, and she became known throughout Nevada for her skill and compassion. Michael's art was shown in galleries as far away as San Francisco, and Katherine loved the irony that her son's paintings now hung in the homes of people like the family she had left behind. Zach and Katherine retired from daily work but stayed involved, offering advice and support. They spent their days tending a small garden, reading, visiting with grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. After decades of hard work and raising children and building a business, they finally had time to just be together. On a warm spring day, when Katherine was 62 years old, she and Zach sat on the porch watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard. Jacob's daughters had children of their own now. Katherine's hair was silver, her hands marked by decades of work and life, but she felt more content than she ever had. "Do you remember," she said to Zach, "when Vivian Patterson tried to ruin me at that dance? When she announced to everyone about my broken engagement?" Zach chuckled, his laugh deeper and rougher with age. "How could I forget? I thought you were going to faint, but then you just stood there, chin up, refusing to be ashamed." "I was terrified," Katherine admitted. "But then you said those things about me being brave, about making the right choice, and suddenly I was not scared anymore. Because you saw me, Zach, really saw me. Not as a scandal or a coward or a foolish woman throwing away security. You saw me as someone brave enough to choose hope over certainty." "That is what you were," Zach said firmly. "Still are, actually. Bravest person I know." Katherine leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sun paint golden light across the desert she had learned to love. "You know what the funny thing is? My father spent his whole life accumulating wealth, building an empire, making sure the Elsworth name meant something. And now, 37 years after I ran away, none of that matters. The company he built was sold off years ago. The mansion is owned by someone else. His name is mostly forgotten. But this," she gestured at the playing children, at the house they had built, at the life they had created. "This endures. Love endures. Family endures. The values we pass to our children and they pass to theirs. Kindness, integrity, hard work, respect, those endure." "Your father was wrong," Zach said quietly, "about what mattered, about what was worth preserving." "He was," Katherine agreed, "but I am grateful to him in a strange way, because his blindness forced me to see clearly, forced me to run, to search, to choose something better." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from decades of partnership. One of the great-grandchildren, a little girl about 5 years old, ran up to the porch. "Great-grandmother," she called, "tell us the story again, about how you and great-grandfather met." Katherine smiled and gestured for the children to gather around. This had become a frequent request, and she never tired of telling it. The children settled on the porch steps, looking up at her with eager faces. "Well," Katherine began, "it was the year 1884, and I had just done something very brave and very foolish. I had run away from a wedding to a man I did not love, and I arrived in Tonopah with nothing but one small trunk and a head full of hope." She told the story. Katherine caught Zach's eye and saw him smiling. They had told this story dozens of times over the years to their children, and now their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And every time, Katherine emphasized the same lesson, that love was worth more than money, that courage meant choosing the unknown over the certain but wrong, that real partnership meant being seen and valued for who you truly were. "And then what happened?" one of the little boys asked breathlessly when she got to the part about the dance. "Then your great-grandfather stood up in front of the whole town," Katherine said, reaching over to take Zach's gnarled hand in her own. "And he told everyone that I had been brave, that choosing love over wealth was the most courageous thing he had ever seen. And he said something I will never forget. He said, 'You made the right choice.'" "Did you?" the little girl asked. "Make the right choice?" Katherine looked at Zach, at their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, at the life they had built from nothing but hope and hard work and love. "Yes," she said firmly, "I made the right choice, the best choice of my entire life." The children eventually ran off to play again, and Katherine and Zach sat watching them until the sun began to set. As twilight painted the sky purple and gold, Zach squeezed her hand. "No regrets?" he asked, like he still sometimes did after all these years. "Not a single one," Katherine said honestly. "I traded wealth for the hope of real love. And Zach, I got so much more than I ever dreamed. I got you. I got our family. I got a life that mattered. I got to be myself, fully and completely, without apology or pretense. What more could anyone ask for?" "I love you, Katherine Elsworth Harper," Zach said, using her full married name the way he only did on special occasions. "I loved you when you stepped off that stage looking lost and determined all at once. I loved you when you caught that supplier cheating us. I loved you when you stood up to Vivian with your chin raised and your spine straight. I loved you through pregnancies and births and raising wild children. And I love you now, more than ever, more than I can say." "I love you too," Katherine whispered, tears slipping down her weathered cheeks. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for valuing me. Thank you for proving, every single day for nearly 40 years, that I made the right choice." They sat together until the stars came out, the same stars that had shone on them that first night and all the nights since. And Katherine felt such profound peace, such deep contentment, that she almost could not contain it. She had been right all those years ago. Real love was worth everything. The hope she had clung to, the belief that somewhere there was a life where she could be truly seen and valued and loved it, had not been foolish or naive. It had been exactly right. And as she sat there with Zach's hand in hers, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice again. Every single time. Because wealth and status and comfort meant nothing compared to this, to partnership and respect and love that endured through decades and hardships and changes. She had traded wealth for the hope of real love, and she had won everything that mattered, everything that was real, everything that would last long after she was gone, living on in the children and grandchildren who carried forward the values she and Zach had built their life upon. In the end, she realized, that was the true measure of a life well lived. Not how much wealth you accumulated or what status you achieved, but how much love you gave and received, how many lives you touched, how strong a foundation you built for those who came after. And by that measure, Katherine knew she had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. As they finally rose to go inside, Zach paused and turned to her. In the lamplight spilling from the windows, she could still see the young man who had carried her trunk and offered her work and stood up for her when she needed it most. Age had changed him, But the essential Zach honest, kind, strong remained unchanged. "You made the right choice," he said one more time, and Katherine heard in his voice all the years of partnership and love, all the struggles overcome and joys shared. "I did," she agreed, and kissed him there on the porch of the house they had built together, surrounded by the desert wind and the star-filled sky and the sound of their family inside. She had traded wealth for the hope of real love, and she had found it. In the most unexpected place, with the most extraordinary man, she had found exactly what she was looking for. And that, Katherine thought, as they walked inside together, hand in hand, just like they had for nearly 40 years, was the greatest treasure of all.